Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops, number 2 of series 13. The question for today is, does a four-state classification enable a more explicit account of consciousness and value? A reading from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value. Just read the introduction. We have previously defined the problem of human existence in terms of consciousness and value. But both the concepts of consciousness and value have been neglected and poorly understood. So we are now making this age-old question more explicit by posing it in the context of consciousness with a four-state classification of cognition, affect, will, and value. Yet consciousness is an integrative concept of not only these four states, but ultimately of all human problems. And value is the particular mental state in which these problems need to be resolved in the form of an affirmation or will to value leading to a certain independence or sufficiency of value. Yet these claims remain to be explicated and argued in subsequent meetings. However, with these ideas, this inquiry is moving towards the center of the issue that is not only also moving, but also changing shape due to different levels of awareness, the variability of human values, and the inconsistencies of circumstance, as thinkers like Nietzsche and Thomas Nagel have implied. Within the given parameters, the relevant movement takes place within the sphere of consciousness and value, yet with the possibility of a consistent direction given by their inherent structures, constraints, and satisfactions. The history of this process has progressed from primitive animism, projected mythologies, and behavior-based ethics to an appreciation of intent, psychology, and mind as a subjective phenomenon. And we can see that these different approaches have changed how activities like religion, ethics, morality, motivation, meaning, and purpose are understood. In Western philosophy, these issues are often discussed within the cognitive, non-cognitive debate, which already operates at high level of generality, abstraction, and appreciation of subjectivity. Yet this approach can be taken further here with the classification of cognition, affect, will, and value, which takes us deeper into the center of the question of human existence. Other advantages of this classification are a clarification of consciousness by naming these states as its constituents, and the elucidation of the character of these states by comparison and contrast to each other, which will also be used as conceptual building blocks vital to further understanding. These four states and their characteristics also enable us to delimit the possibilities of consciousness that are curtailed by knowledge, imagination, death, experience, and the absence of consciousness, but especially with respect to the demarcation and delineation of value as the realm or sphere in which solutions are found in terms of value and its applications and qualities. And to make the case complete, I'm proposing that these four states are exhaustively comprehensive of the constituents of consciousness, which makes these states, as well as consciousness, the parameters of the question of existence. But it may be challenged that all states of consciousness can be accommodated within this classification, or even that the question of human existence need not be answered in terms of mental states, even though that challenge is required to outline what the alternative could be like. The unconscious or personal identity might be such exceptions due to their holistic character, yet they nevertheless can still be constituted by the proprietary four states, and the element of self-awareness significant in personal identity can be included within the general concept of consciousness as reflective self-consciousness. Moreover, both personal identity and self-consciousness can also be understood in terms of self-knowledge, as when consciousness reaches a level where it can apprehend itself within its objects of perception. With respect to value as an aspect of personal identity, we have noted Heidegger and Sartre connecting care and value to personal identity as consciousness. And Paul Ricoeur argues that it is our values that anchor our identity or selfhood. Yet to understand the proposed classification of four states, we should compare it with other such classifications. Immanuel Kant, for example, posed three faculties of mind: ekonen, empheden, and wollen, or cognition, feeling, and will. Wilhelm Dilthey also employed this tripartite schema, but integrated values as an aspect of feeling. Husserl also gave three divisions of consciousness, but as intellectual, volitional, and notably the valuative. Kant omits value, but endorses the related ancient Greek division of physics, ethics, and logic, in which cognition is represented by logic, value by ethics, and the physical world by physics. Analytic philosophy typically reduces Kant's other three categories of cognition, feeling, and will to the two cognitive and non-cognitive mental states. But this classification is biased towards cognitivism and defines non-cognitive states negatively. And like Kant, it also assumes clear distinctions between these states without overlap. Richard Rorty, for example, holds that cognitive and non-cognitive states don't seem to have anything in common except our refusal to call them physical, unquote. But this claim appears to overlook that consciousness is the common feature that both share, as well as the view that I advance here of the four states as ideal types that are better described as a fluid interpenetrating spectrum, counting against any supposedly pure states, notwithstanding arguments about value-laden facts and Hilary Putnam's fact-value entanglement. Analytic philosophy tends to omit value as a specific mental state due to a general neglect of value and a bias towards cognition and epistemology prevalent in Western thought. A few exceptions can be found, such as Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, and religion, but as indicated, religion typically has no concept or theory of value. Yet these comparisons and contrasts of different classifications now need brief definitions of the proprietary four states. Included in these definitions, it's also a useful structural feature that cognitive states like belief, reason, and knowledge necessarily entail mental states which constitute that state. Conversely, affect states are feelings like pleasure and fear that are constituted by their own experience. The will is an impulse towards something or a motive to act, which draws on cognition, affect, will, and value. Value is a collective term which includes values like wanting, liking, loving, and hating, with features like quality, qualia, preference, privilege, affirmation, and phenomenality. These cursory definitions also help to explain relations between willing, acting, wanting, and valuing. The will is invariably a component in such states as the will to power, the will to truth, or the will to value. And an act of willing indicates a readiness or agreement to act, either mentally or physically. Wanting already implies value, yet more so on a desire-based theory of value. And in the phrase to be found wanting, the word wanting further implies an absence of something, which also has implications for the character of value. Moreover, these accounts explain value, values, and valuing as part of the development of willing and wanting. That is, we see it as both the neglect of value and in a growing awareness of value in human development. And this development can take the form of a growing affirmation of value as the will to value, or it can take the form of erroneous objectifications of value. Connections between these states, as well as their development, can also be found in Sartre's concept of the constitution of the ego, that he describes as consisting of actions, states, and qualities. Sartre's ego, however, isn't foundational to consciousness, but is an intentional object formed outside consciousness that serves as a means of a synthetic unification for the ego. This explains how we can incorporate physical action into a constitution of the ego, and how action can reinforce both belief and retrospective justification of moral action. Yet extending the idea, action need not always be physical, as in the case of mental acts and speech acts. And the force of intent required to motivate action can be described as the will. Of the other constituents of the ego, Sartre explains that his states are states such as hate, love, and jealousy that are affect states, and he describes his qualities as the qualities of the ego that represent the ensemble of virtues, latent traits, potentialities which constitute our character and our habits. His word qualities might suggest values, but it isn't directly comparable because Sartre uses the word value differently elsewhere. Yet with respect to cognition, Sartre doesn't refer to cognition at all as a noun or as something in itself in his work Being and Nothingness, but he uses its active form as the verb recognition 67 times. More significantly, in this wider study, Sartre's qualities of the ego are all conceptions of the self, which have the function that I attribute to supporting cognitive frameworks. The different strengths, weaknesses, and functions of cognition, affect, will, and value will be discussed shortly. Yet the question of philosophically justifying this classification arises, even though that pragmatic means of answering this question will predominate here. That is, whether it facilitates our understanding of the issue and enables us to produce a solution. But in philosophy, the question of philosophical justification becomes more important, as in the justification of the perspective in which the four proprietary states are grounded. In this scenario, the justifying perspective will unavoidably be determined by perspectival values, which fortuitously is another feature that underlines the significance of value in the proposed classification. Yet the significance of perspective and priority will be more easily seen in the forthcoming discussions about the practical as well as the theoretical priority of these states relative to each other. A more mundane example is the classification of animal, vegetable, and mineral, determined simply by a practical approach to basic objects in the world. But exceptions like quantum events or logical abstractions would challenge this classification. Such exceptions and different perspectives challenge the particular categories that make up the classification. For example, why should value be a separate category and not a kind of cognition? Or why isn't it an affect state? Or why can't meaning be included in the classification or make value an aspect of meaning? The answer is that value is the essential feature of multiple activities, including meaning, but meaning is not. But resolution is more difficult when competing categories are the fundamental ones of cognition and value. Yet value cannot be an aspect of cognition or vice versa because they have incompatible properties and functions. That is, value has phenomenal qualities, whereas cognition is constituted by its objects, and cognition offers facts and reason, whereas value principally provides justification and motivation. So two ways of challenging classifications is by exceptions and by their justifying points of view. Applying these challenges to the classification of cognition, affect, will, and value, we can say here that consciousness is the determinant value of that perspective. Yet with some justification, we can say that consciousness has a privileged point of view. This is because consciousness is fundamentally what we are, and all experience is contained within it. That is, consciousness determines a point of view from which we cannot escape. So we can provisionally use its inescapability to justify that point of view. Then the justification of the categories of cognition, affect, will, and value can be tested shortly by looking at their credentials as constituents of consciousness, as well as by looking at whether exceptions can be found to their comprehensiveness. Another way of testing such categories is through the adequacy of the objectives which they are serving. We have noted the practical objective of understanding the topic. This entails the implied objective of a solution in terms of value worked out in these chapters. Yet consciousness is also being advanced as a means of justifying a certain perspective. But as suggested earlier, consciousness itself isn't an adequate human objective, or perhaps for some purposes, an adequate determinant of a point of view. That is, the general character of consciousness seems to prevent any specific property being named as an objective. This is because consciousness can be characterized as a multiplicity of states rather than a single entity. And if we did single out a specific entity, then that property would be the objective, not consciousness, as we have done with value as the candidate objective. Yet another possible problem for consciousness in this context is the physicalist claim that it doesn't really exist. Daniel Dennett, for instance, argues that consciousness only has a notional existence, like unicorns. A more moderate view is that only disparate mental states exist, not consciousness as a single entity. But we have defined consciousness as the sum of its mental states, and there are relations between these states, making the whole greater than the sum of its parts. The question of whether consciousness exists or not can't be argued at length at the moment, but I have said that consciousness can be provisionally defined in terms of its mental states, which irrefutably exist, and consciousness does have a unity around personal identity in time and space. That is, consciousness is centered not only around these states, but also around my brain, my body, on one continuous timeline. That is, I don't have perceptions over there, feelings in a different place, values in another, and these experiences are centered on a personal identity that can be expressed with the statement, I am. However, another challenge to both the concept of consciousness and the categories of cognition, affect, will, and value can be found in postmodernism that decries privilege and thereby brings an even more potent criticism to all substantive applications of value like ethics, purpose, and meaning, both experiential and epistemic, as well as to the supposed privilege of a perspective that supports any system or classification. With respect to classifications, Postmodernists also hold that even using such terms restricts us to a modular or classificatory way of thinking, which is an oversimplification of discourse. That is, in reality, cannot have such boundaries. The reader claims, for example, that meanings are both historical and structural, relating to immediate meanings in language. In his obscurantist style, he refers to diachronic and synchronic kinds of signs or meanings. For Derrida, this means that meanings really refers to all other references which are absent. But this cannot be done, till the full meaning of anything can't be fully articulated. So the postmodernist critique is of any form of universalization, privileged meanings, or classifications. But I'm skeptical whether the postmodern theory of meaning, or non-meaning, is either coherent or takes us much further than standard critiques of language, such as Wittgenstein's complex theory of meaning. The outcome being that there are no fixed, absolute, or definitive meanings, leaving us with the thought that the mountain has brought forth a mouse. Nevertheless, Jean-François Lyotard's definition of postmodernism as an incredulity towards meta-narratives like Marxism and religion goes beyond Enlightenment values, ethics, and even science to reject a general or universal concept of consciousness. Yet in rejecting the idea of consciousness, postmodernists automatically reject any structures of consciousness that can provide a coherent conception of consciousness, as well as provide in this investigation both an inescapable perspective and a basis for understanding the origins of value. It helps to understand that Derrida attacks the view that a finite structure can underlie the whole network of a culture. That is, postmodernism typically rejects the linguistic, social, and psychological structures such as of Saussure, Marx, and Freud. But what postmodernist thinking prevents being seen is a conception of consciousness with structures that are not social or psychological constructs, but first-hand experiences and conditions of existence. And this is the conception of consciousness that grounds the thinking in this work. Yet further to that thinking, the difficulties of perspective, priority, and consciousness as problems of value can, however, be elucidated or made more problematic by comparisons with Heidegger's concept of being that includes the idea of Dasein or being there, which is largely equivalent to the concept of consciousness. Yet it can be noted that given the neglect of consciousness as an analogue of Dasein, that is an aspect of being, it becomes significant that Heidegger claimed that the question of being, in which we can include human existence, has been forgotten since the pre-Socratics. There are specific reasons why consciousness has been overlooked that need to be explained in due course, but one of them is related to consciousness as the totality of experience, which thereby becomes difficult to discern in contrast to other experiences of the same type that are necessarily absent. Similarly, the idea of being as the totality of things also becomes difficult to apprehend for several reasons. One of them is, in addition to the problem of contrast, Hegel claimed that being is the most general of all categories and therefore empty. The idea of being is paradoxically also an archetypal notion in metaphysics that Heidegger rejected. In his The End of Philosophy as Metaphysics, because it focused on beings rather than being and separated existence and essence. This was followed by Sartre's endorsement of Nietzsche's description of metaphysics as the illusion of worlds behind the scene. Given these concerns about the concept of being and its associations with metaphysics as a suspect system, we should consider whether Heidegger has over-ambitiously described the totality of things in the world as the category of being, which also invites Gilbert Ryle's category mistake. That is, being is a misleading hypostatization or reification of everything in the world, and that this totality is just the totality of everything that exists, and should not be taken as the category of being. John Searle goes so far as to say that if you can use being as a noun, or worse yet, being, you are in serious intellectual difficulties. Thomas Sheehan similarly holds that such usage suggests an ethereal metaphysical reality. For all these reasons, I never use the word being as a noun. I prefer the word existence. Moreover, Heidegger's notion of an experience of being is even more idiosyncratic. It is idiosyncratic for the same reasons as belief in an experience of God, nirvana, or the great crocodile spirit. That is, such are so incomparable, subjective, and lacking in context that they are incomprehensible. Yet these critiques of metaphysics and Heidegger's concept of being are primarily made here in order to introduce the problem of prioritization for totalities like consciousness, being, and comprehensive classifications like cognition, affect, will, and value. For example, Heidegger regards the question of being as having ontological priority over the ontical sciences. Ontology refers to the fundamental existences of things like the world and consciousness. Ontic refers to particular expressions in such forms as physical, historical, and sociological events. But we must seriously question how Heidegger's ontological priority is justified, just as we have questioned the justification of the four-state classification. In the natural world, laws of physics are prerequisite to understanding sequences of natural events, and the fact of existence is logically and ontologically prior to further understanding these things. But for being as an objective, hierarchies of explanation or necessary sequences of events aren't enough. This is because we aren't just dealing with an explanation or an ontology, but a preference of human choice. That is, logical, ontological, or physical priority does not vindicate evaluative priority. And for that, we must look to the structures of consciousness and the choices given to value. Yet Heidegger's notion of being does include Dasein as human existence or possibly consciousness, that Heidegger eschews as a misleading idea, as he did of Sartre's notion of being for itself. Yet in the context of priority, the concept of consciousness as a being in the world is given significance as a fundamental form of existence in which humans subsist, a perspective from which we cannot escape, and the origins of value, the value with which we make fundamental judgments about our lives. In conclusion, we can reiterate several origins of the classification of cognition, affect, will, and value. These included the limitations of the cognitive non-cognitive distinction in analytic philosophy, as well as the classifications of Immanuel Kant, Wilhelm Dilthey, and Edmund Husserl, together with a comparison with Sartre's constitution of the ego. This four-state classification clarifies the constituents of consciousness as well as elucidating the states themselves so that they can be used as conceptual building blocks, in addition to delimiting the possibilities of consciousness, especially with respect to the demarcation and delineation of value. Yet criticisms of both metaphysics and Heidegger's concept of being illustrated the problems of perspective and priority for classificatory systems, especially for supposedly comprehensive systems that nevertheless pointed to solutions by virtue of that very comprehensiveness. The challenge of postmodern critiques to such classifications was found to be largely vacuous, and that the concepts of cognition, affect, will, and value appear to remain as the building blocks for a coherent understanding of human existence as consciousness. Yet to get there, we will have to examine each of these states in turn that will also serve as part of the justification of this classification. So let me have your comments and criticisms at the meeting or on websites like Zoom and meetup.com.